Well, good morning, everybody. Big pleasure to be here today. Paris Agreement, in my eyes, one of the major reasons why it was possible after so many years of failure to reach actually a global deal in Paris was the fact that the climate scientists had shown us and given proof that, first of all, climate change is real, and second, that we still have a budget that is smaller than 1,000 gigatons of CO2 that we can still emit on this planet if we want to avoid dangerous climate change. So my interpretation of this Paris Agreement is that we try to lower the carbon emissions as soon as possible, because if we would continue at the same level as today, this budget that I just talked about would be used up in less than 30 years, and then we would run into this dangerous climate change. So the idea of the Paris Agreement is to lower the global emissions as soon as possible, to stretch the budget, and then in the course of the century move on to a zero emission, to a decarbonized world economy. Now, it was agreed in Paris that the industrialized countries go ahead, since we carry a major responsibility. And now, of course, I very much agree with what has been said before. Paris does not deliver the instruments yet. Actually, if we add up the commitments of the 195 countries that met in Paris, we know that that alone is not going to make us meet this target of keeping the global temperature increase below 2 degrees, definitely not at a level of 1.5 degree increase. So we need to work on that. Let me talk about now what the situation in Germany actually is, because we don't have to change our targets. There is a broad consensus in our parliament. All the parties that are represented there have voted several times in the last years that we as Germany want to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 by at least 80 to 95%. So 80 to 95% is already pretty close to decarbonization. So it's not about changing the targets, it's about implementing these targets. When I look at the time frame, 2050 seems incredibly long away, but it's only 34 years. So what we need to do now is actually we need to come up with a smart strategy for meeting these targets and at the same time making this an economic success story. Because if we continue as we have done over quite a few years, if we continue to invest in fossil structures, we are going to put people in the future into the squeeze of either destroying these investments by not allowing investors to use these investments any longer because they're not compatible with the climate targets, or we need public money, we need money from the taxpayers to buy these investments out of the market. So if we want to move on to 80 to 95% reduction in emissions in Germany, we need to look at the structure. Many people in this country believe, well, 80 to 95%, my own emissions are 5 to 15% of this 100%, so climate protection happens in the other sectors. I can continue as I have done in the past. This is definitely not going to work, because we have emissions here in this country that we cannot substitute through efficiency and renewables. These are, for example, the process-related emissions in our industry. There are also emissions in the agricultural sector, methane, for example, that you cannot substitute through efficiency or renewables. And if you add these emissions up, where we don't have an answer yet, where renewables and efficiency don't help, well, they make up about at least 14, 15%. So the conclusion of that is, if we in Germany want to meet that target of 80 to 95% reductions by 2050 in the sectors of power, in the sectors of heating and cooling, and the transportation sector, we are talking about zero emissions in 2050. Now, as I said before, if we want to do this in a smart way, we are not allowing investments now in fossil structures that turn out to be misallocated funds, create lock-in effects, and make it even harder in the future to meet these targets. So we need a paradigm shift with a clear priority of investments in efficiency and renewables. So if you look at the various sectors, in the power sector, indeed, we have already achieved quite a bit. Last year, Germany came close to 33% of renewables in our power sector. But part of that story is that as we have been increasing renewables in our power sector, it didn't go along with an equivalent reduction of fossil production of electricity. Part of that went into additional exports. So we have an incredible success story of increasing renewables in this country, but we don't have an equivalent success story in reduction of CO2 emissions from the power sector. And one of the major reasons is that Germany is one of the biggest exporters of electricity now in Europe. So what we need is not only a strategy for efficiency and renewables, we also need a strategy of getting out of fossil production of electricity. First important step government has taken now, and that is that we are taking 13% of our lignite production out of the market. But this is exactly the kind of politics that we should avoid in the future. First investment, and then afterwards taking taxpayers' money to buy these investments out of the market. There was a huge conflict in this country last year over the right strategy, because we not only have climate targets for 2050, but also for 2020 and 2030 and 2040 that lead up to this decarbonization in 2040. And when we realized we would not meet our targets for 2020, there was a debate what to do about the fossil production of electricity. And the result at the end was we're taking 13% of our lignite production capacities off the market, and we reimburse the investors. Now, if we don't want to continue this kind of a strategy, there has to be this very clear priority, efficiency and renewables, and no more investments into fossil structures, because otherwise we're going to repeat that discussion that we had last year in this country almost every year in the future. Concretely, this means no more investments in expansion of mines, lignite mines, no more investments into hard coal or lignite generators. We still most likely will need investments into gas generation capacities, not now, but sometime maybe in the middle of the next decade. But then until 2050, we have to substitute natural gas through gas that is being produced through renewable sources, may it be biomass or may it even be electricity via power to gas. Let me say that the power sector is the one that worries me the least, because there we already have the technologies. It's mainly a political decision now to implement them, and implement them in a smart way so that we use this process as a modernization process. It's much more difficult in the housing sector. Housing sector is one of the largest, also after power sector, one of the largest sectors that is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. And in this area, investments have the longest lifespan. A new building that is being built here in Germany lasts for at least 100 years. So it is extremely important that we move on quickly now to build houses that do not rely on fossil heating or cooling in the future. And the first answer, of course, is efficiency. Build them in a way that they don't need as much energy for heating or cooling as buildings did in the past. And then, of course, we need to build them in a way that at least by 2030, new installations into heating systems happen on a renewable basis. Because investments into heating systems have a lifespan of about 20 years, so if we don't stop investing in fossil heating systems by 2030, we're still going to use them until 2050, and as I said, also in the heating cooling sector, emissions have to be brought down to zero. Possibly the most difficult sector is going to be the transportation sector. I just said a few minutes ago that we have already come a long way in the power sector, and we have reduced emissions in the power sector over the last years actually substantially, but in the transport sector we failed completely in this country. The emissions of the power sector are the same as in the base year of the Kyoto Protocol, 1990. No reductions so far, no. There are parts where we already use electricity, that's the public transportation area. There are areas where we don't have an answer yet. For example, transportation, road transportation, trucks. But of course, we have technological answers to the issue of private cars and company cars. And that is the electrification of our car fleet. But if you look at the fact that cars have a lifespan of about 20 years, and if you don't want to drive cars with diesel and gasoline in 2050, then the target for 2030 must be zero emissions. New cars with zero emissions at the latest 2030. Otherwise, we're going to still have cars on our road that drive with diesel and gasoline in 2050. And that might be one of the biggest challenges. Right now, within Europe, where we define the CO2 emissions that we allow to the fleets of car producers, we always looked at, well, actually, what can the industry achieve by improving engines that run with diesel and gasoline? And that's how we set the standards. If we continue like that, we're going to fail. If we don't want to still drive in 2050 with fossil engines, then by 2030, the target must be zero emissions. So this is, I know, altogether a big challenge, but I think it is also a fantastic opportunity. In the wake of Paris, I think there's going to be now a competition between countries, which country is going to develop the most efficient modernization strategy to meet the targets of Paris. So the race is on. And I personally believe if we think in investment cycles, if we make sure that we don't create lock-in effects, if we really put a priority now on efficiency and renewables, I think we can lead as Germany. We do have a lead, but we have to continue this path in order to have our nose up front, because this is also a great opportunity for our industry, because the markets, the new markets that are developing now, they will not only be strong markets here in Germany, but they will be also strong export markets for the German industry. Thank you very much for your attention.